The rain poured relentlessly that evening, turning the streets into rivers of murky water. The city, bustling by day, had now grown quiet, except for one small figure, huddled beneath a damp cardboard box in the corner of an alley. The boy, no, older than 4, shivered as he pulled the edges of the box tighter around him, trying to block out the cold, the hunger, and the fear that seemed to grip him with each passing minute. This wasn't his home. This wasn't where he was supposed to be. But for now, it was all he had. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a man in his early 30s sat in the luxury of his penthouse, staring at the glow of his computer screen, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. David Martin was a successful entrepreneur, a millionaire in fact. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but an idea and a lot of hard work. Money had never been an issue for David. He had everything he could ever want. Expensive cars, lavish vacations, fine dining. But there was one thing he couldn't seem to shake: the feeling that something was missing. It was the type of question millionaires like David didn't often ask themselves. After all, what did he lack? But lately, a void had been growing inside him. No matter how much he earned, no matter how many deals he closed, there was still a nagging emptiness that whispered to him in quiet moments. So, when an unexpected opportunity came his way, he decided to take a chance, one that would change his life forever. It was a cold call, at least. That's how it started. David had been contacted by a charity looking for sponsors for a new initiative aimed at helping homeless children. Normally, he would have brushed off something like this. He had his hands full with his businesses. But something about the way the woman spoke on the other end of the line caught his attention. There was an urgency in her voice, a passion that he couldn't ignore. She mentioned the situation of a child who had nowhere to go, a 4-year-old boy named Lucas. She described how the boy had been found in a cardboard box, trying to sleep in the harsh cold of the city streets. David listened. He felt a familiar pang in his chest, but quickly dismissed it. He had heard stories like this before. He had donated to causes, attended charity galas, and even made sizable contributions to organizations over the years. But deep down, he had never really connected with any of it. It was just something he did because it felt good to give. But this time, something was different. He had heard a story about a child, a real child, not just a statistic, and it stayed with him. He made the decision to meet the woman who had called him. He needed to know more about Lucas, about what had happened to him. Maybe it was the rainy night, or maybe it was just the realization that he had never truly faced the reality of what poverty looked like. He arranged a meeting, and within hours, David was heading to the charity's headquarters. As he entered the modest building, David was greeted by the woman on the phone, along with a few others who worked for the organization. They spoke of their work with passion, explaining the conditions under which children like Lucas lived. They told him of Lucas's story, the boy who had been abandoned, left alone with no one to care for him. But what David didn't know was that this would be more than just another donation. It would become the beginning of an unexpected journey, a journey that would shake him to his core. The next morning, David found himself in the heart of the city, following the directions he had been given. The streets looked different now. No longer were they filled with the noise of cars and people hurrying to work. Instead, they seemed quieter, heavier, as if the weight of the world was hidden just beneath the surface. The alley where he was told to meet the boy was small and narrow, tucked between 2 tall buildings that blocked out the sun. It was here that David found himself standing, heart pounding in his chest. At first, he didn't see the boy. All he could hear was the sound, of distant voices, the occasional hum of a passing car, and the soft patter of rain hitting the pavement. Then, through the dim light of the alley, David noticed a small figure curled up beneath a torn cardboard box. The boy's face was pale, his clothes ragged and dirty. His tiny hands clutched the edges of the box as though it were the only thing keeping him safe. David's breath caught in his throat. He had seen images of children like this on the news, in documentaries, and in the charity brochures. But seeing it in real life was something entirely different. This was no longer a statistic. This was no longer a story. This was real. The boy looked up, startled by the sound of footsteps, his big brown eyes locking with David's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The rain continued to fall, but David couldn't take his eyes off the child. He had no idea what to say. What could he possibly say to a boy who had lived through so much at such a young age? The boy didn't speak, but David could see the confusion, the fear, and the sadness in his gaze. The woman from the charity stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "This is Lucas," she said softly. "He's been living like this for months now. We've been trying to find him a home, but it's not always easy. Sometimes the system fails kids like him." David's mind was spinning. He had always been told that he could solve any problem with money. But this was different. There was no amount of wealth, no business deal that could make this go away. This was a human being, a child who had suffered far too much for his age, and David was suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of it all. As he stood there, looking down at Lucas, David knew he couldn't walk away from this, but he didn't know how to fix it, or if it could even be fixed. There was so much more to learn, so much more to uncover. What had happened to Lucas's family? How had he ended up on the streets? And most importantly, what could David do to help? The answers weren't clear, and as the rain continued to pour, David felt a sense of uncertainty grip him. But one thing was certain. This was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. As the story unfolds, the truth behind Lucas's heartbreaking situation begins to unravel in unexpected ways. What David discovers will challenge everything he thought he knew about life, privilege, and what it truly means to make a difference. And as for Lucas, his story is far from over. David's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The rain beat down on the alley, a constant reminder of the harsh reality Lucas was living in. He took a step closer to the boy, unsure of what to say or how to help. Lucas had pulled his knees to his chest and tucked his head into his arms, almost as if he were trying to make himself invisible. "I don't know what to do," David muttered, under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He had always been a man of solutions, business deals, investments, strategies. He could handle all of that, but this was something he had never prepared for. The woman from the charity, Maria, stepped forward, her eyes full of empathy. "It's not easy, David. We've tried every avenue we can. Social services, foster care, you name it. But for kids like Lucas, things often fall through the cracks. It's like they're invisible to the system." David's mind flickered back to his own childhood, his own memories of comfort and safety. His parents had always made sure he had everything he needed. He never had to worry about where he would sleep or whether he would eat. He had always been taken care of. The stark contrast between his life and Lucas's was overwhelming. It was almost as if David had been blind to the suffering around him. He had lived in a bubble, untouched by the struggles that millions of children faced every day. But now, standing in this alley, staring at the frail boy before him, he could no longer deny the harsh truth. It wasn't just a story on a news segment or a photo in a charity pamphlet. This was real, and something in David's gut told him that he couldn't just walk away. He had to do something. But what? Maria watched him closely, sensing the turmoil inside him. I know this isn't easy to understand, but Lucas isn't the only one. There are so many kids out there like him. They need help, real help. Not just donations or a handout, but something that changes their lives for good. David shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion that clouded his thoughts. But how do we fix this? How do we make a real difference? Maria paused, glancing at Lucas, who was now sitting up, but still avoiding eye contact. She crouched down to the boy's level, speaking softly to him. Lucas, this is Mr. Martin. He's here to help you. Lucas didn't respond, but his eyes flickered briefly toward David. There was a moment of recognition, but it quickly faded as the boy turned away again. David's heart sank. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, and after everything Lucas had been through, how could anyone blame him for being cautious? Lucas hasn't spoken in weeks. Maria continued, her voice tinged with sorrow. After everything he's been through, being abandoned, living on the streets, he's lost his voice in more ways than one. He doesn't trust anyone, not anymore. David couldn't imagine the kind of pain that would make a child lose hope like that, and yet he could see it in Lucas's eyes. The fear, the confusion, the feeling of being utterly alone. How could someone so young carry such a burden? How could a system designed to protect children fail so terribly? Maria stood up, her face tight with frustration. It's not just about Lucas. It's about every child who's been failed by the system, every child who doesn't have a voice. That's the real issue here. The system isn't built to protect these kids. It's built to push them through the cracks, to leave them behind. David took a deep breath, trying to absorb what Maria was saying. He had always known that poverty and homelessness existed, but he had never truly understood the depth of it. He had seen the statistics, read the articles, but none of it had ever felt as real as it did right now. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of something much larger than just one boy's plight. So what's the plan? David asked, his voice shaking with the weight of the question. What can I do? I can't just throw money at this. This is bigger than that. I need to understand how to really make a difference. Maria looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then with a quiet sigh, she spoke. It's not just about money. It's about community. It's about creating a support system. It's about offering these kids a real chance at life. Not just surviving, but thriving. The problem isn't that we don't have enough resources. The problem is that we're not using them in the right way. David's mind raced. He had always been a businessman, focused on maximizing efficiency, scaling operations, and driving growth. But he'd never thought of these things in the context of helping people. Could he apply what he knew about business to the charity sector? Could he really make an impact in a way that would be sustainable? Maria's words echoed in his mind. It's not just about money. He had to dig deeper. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. It wasn't going to be a simple donation or a flashy campaign. This was going to take work, real work, over the next few days. David threw himself into learning everything he could about the child welfare system. He met with social workers, foster care organizations, and child advocates. He began to understand the flaws in the system, how it was underfunded, overstretched, and often failed to prioritize the children who needed help the most. But as he dug deeper, he uncovered something else. There was a disconnect between the resources available and the children who needed them. There was a lack of coordination, a lack of true community support, and above all, a lack of trust. The more David learned, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a single child. It was about an entire generation of children who had been left behind by a broken system. But fixing it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take more than just money. It was going to take a complete shift in how society viewed its responsibility to vulnerable children. And just as David was beginning to formulate a plan, the phone call came. Maria's voice on the other end was frantic. Her words a blur of panic. "David, it's Lucas." "He's gone." David's heart stopped. "What do you mean gone?" Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "He ran away. We don't know where he is. He's disappeared. And we don't know what to do." David's mind raced. How could this happen? He had just started to understand how deep the problem ran, and now this. Was it too late to help Lucas? Had he lost him before he could even begin? David's heart pounded in his chest as Maria's words echoed in his mind. Lucas is gone. He tried to steady his breath, pushing down the rising panic. He had barely begun to understand the depth of Lucas's pain, and now the child had disappeared, slipping through the cracks once again. The helplessness that David felt in that moment was suffocating. "Maria, tell me everything." David's voice was sharp, trying to focus on the details. "How long has he been gone? Where could he be?" Maria's voice quivered as she answered. "It's been hours now. We searched the streets, the alleys, everywhere we could think of, but we have no idea where he went. I'm scared, David. What if he's lost out there?" David didn't respond right away. His mind raced through every possibility, each one more terrifying than the last. Where would a 4-year-old boy go? In a city like this, alone, scared, with nowhere to turn. The thought of Lucas wandering the streets, vulnerable and scared, made David's stomach churn. Without wasting another second, David made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of his penthouse, driving through the streets with a single thought in his mind: find Lucas. The city was a maze of concrete and steel, but David wasn't going to stop. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning every corner, every alleyway. He'd been part of the business world for so long, working in boardrooms and meetings, but now this felt different. This was about a life, a human being. It wasn't something he could negotiate or strategize his way out of. He had to act. As he drove through the city, David thought back to the times when he had walked past homeless people or seen children in need. He had always looked away, thinking there was nothing he could do. But now, facing the consequences of his inaction, he realized how wrong he had been. There were people like Lucas out there every day, struggling to survive in a world that had forgotten them. And now, he had the chance to make things right, to be the one who didn't turn a blind eye. Hours passed, and the search grew more desperate. David had contacted the local authorities, but the police were already stretched thin, dealing with the city's growing number of homeless. It wasn't enough to simply call in a missing child report. David needed more. He needed to be the one who found Lucas. And so, he kept searching, asking everyone he met on the streets if they had seen the small boy with the brown eyes, the one hiding under the cardboard box. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, David's eyes caught a figure huddled in a doorway. He pulled his car to a stop and rushed toward the boy. There, crouched against the cold brick wall, was Lucas. His clothes were drenched from the rain, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes, those eyes that had been so full of fear, now looked up at David with a mix of confusion and hope. David knelt beside him, breathing a sigh of relief. "Lucas," he said softly, his voice trembling. "It's okay. You're safe now. We're going to get you home." For a moment, Lucas said nothing. But then, in the quiet stillness of the alley, he reached out a trembling hand toward David. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was the first sign of trust David had seen from the boy. "Thank you." Maria's voice echoed from behind him. She had arrived, out of breath, but clearly relieved. "We've been looking everywhere." David nodded, a sense of determination filling him. "It's not over yet. We have work to do." The days that followed were filled with long meetings, phone calls, and planning. David couldn't shake the image of Lucas, huddled in that doorway, looking like he had lost all sense of safety. It was clear to him now that helping Lucas wasn't just about offering a roof over his head. It was about healing the trauma, building trust, and creating a stable environment where children like Lucas could feel loved and cared for. David's newfound purpose led him to spearhead a new initiative, one that went beyond traditional charity. It was a comprehensive program that connected children with not only housing, but also therapy, education, and the necessary support to rebuild their lives. He worked tirelessly to create a network of businesses, organizations, and community leaders who would help make this dream a reality. His company would no longer just be about profit. It would be about purpose. Months later, the first residential community for at-risk children was opened. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to grow, to learn, and to feel safe. Lucas was one of the first children to move in, but there were many others. Children who had been abandoned, neglected, or forgotten by the system. Children who, like Lucas, deserved more than just a second chance. David stood outside the building on the opening day, watching as the kids ran through the playground, laughing and playing. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had done more than just save one child. He had helped create a future for many. Looking back, David realized how much had changed within him. He had gone from being a man who thought his success meant everything to someone who understood that true success was measured by the impact he had on others. No amount of wealth or business deals could compare to the feeling of knowing that he had helped give a child a chance at a better life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David watched Lucas and the other children, the weight of their pasts slowly lifting as they stepped into their new futures. And for the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of peace. There was still work to be done, of course. The system wasn't fixed overnight. But for Lucas, and for so many others like him, the journey had begun. David knew that this was just the beginning. There was always more to do, more children to help, and more lives to change. But in that moment, watching Lucas smile for the first time in what felt like forever, David understood one thing. Real change was possible, and he was going to make sure it kept happening, one child at a time.